This is a special midweek edition of Judaism Unbound, Untangling Tselem Elohim. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Lex Rofberg. Unfortunately, no Dan Liebenson today, but we do have an amazing guest with us today, Rafael Neis, who we are jazzed to be joining the show for a conversation about their upcoming course with us in the Yeshiva called Untangling Tselem Elohim. Tselem Elohim is the Hebrew phrase that is generally translated the image of God, or in the image of God. That's B'Tselem Elohim. And we're excited to be offering a class where Rafael Neis will be looking at this term and also noticing ways in which it hasn't only had a positive influence on our world. There's actually some shadow sides. And when we can look at those shadow sides and think deeply about them, it can impact our Jewish practice in a positive way and allow us to channel our Judaism a little more effectively and in ways that have the potential to better liberate our world. So we're excited to feature that class and, as a little sneak preview, to have a conversation here on the podcast that offers you a window into the class. So we understand if you're like, oh, okay, I see that this looks cool, but I want to hear from the teacher first before I decide to sign up. That's valid. Listen to this episode. You're going to be wildly impressed, and then you're going to want to go to judaismunbound.com/classes. That's the place to sign up, and sign up. There is financial aid available for anybody who needs it. Just head to the registration page, and you can find it there. We hope that you will be excited to learn more from Rafael Neis, but here's a little bit about them as we kick off this conversation today. Rafael Neis is a scholar, writer, educator, and artist. A professor of history and Judaic studies, they are director of the Interdepartmental Program in Ancient History and hold the Jean and Samuel Frankel Chair in Rabbinics at the University of Michigan. Neis has a PhD in Jewish Studies from Harvard University, a Master's in Religious Studies from Boston University, and a law degree from the London School of Economics. They studied painting at the Bezalel Academy of Art and Design, at Camden Working Men's College, and throughout their graduate studies. Neis's first book, called The Sense of Sight in Rabbinic Culture, Jewish Ways of Seeing in Late Antiquity, won the Barron Prize from the American Academy for Jewish Research, and was also an honorable mention for the Jordan Schnitzer Award from the Association for Jewish Studies. Their second book, entitled When a Human Gives Birth to a Raven, Rabbis and the Reproduction of Species, is the topic of our conversation today and plays a central role in their upcoming course in the Yeshiva, which again is entitled Untangling Tselem Elohim. Rafael Neis, welcome to Judaism Unbound. We're so thrilled to have you on the show.
Thanks, Lex. It's fantastic to be here.
Awesome. So your class is coming up, but I don't want to start just yet with the ins and outs of what those 3 weeks are going to be. We'll get there. But I want to start by holding a phrase that comes up in your awesome book, which is human exceptionalism. It really struck me because I think Jewishly, and especially as progressive Jews, a lot of us have spent time in the past thinking about notions of, say, Jewish exceptionalism and some of the shadow sides of Jewish chosenness and all of those debates that people have. We have spent much less time thinking about human exceptionalism, human chosenness is not really a phrase, but I actually think it's kind of operating similarly. So I just wanted to throw it to you. We have this class and this book that are interested in the notion of Tselem Elohim, exploring it deeper and asking questions about it. What can we notice? What can we think about human exceptionalism and how it ties to ways we've been taught or maybe should rethink in the image of God, B'Tselem Elohim?
I love that question, first of all. It's great to juxtapose the ways that progressive, left and radical Jews and folks of other various identifications are aware of, as you put it, Jewish exceptionalism and various other forms of exceptionalism, and often the move to deflate Jewish exceptionalism is ironically the invocation of the idea that we're all human and that we're all sacred. We're all divine, actually. Your juxtaposition is beautiful because actually this is where Tselem Elohim, specifically the idea of the human being in God's image, disguises its own version of exceptionalism because it is taken to be the magnificent promoter of choose your medicine, equality, radical multiplicity, but somehow that we are all united or allied under the aegis of God's image. And in a way, this is where I point to the ways that before we even get to the point that I make in my book, which is Tselem Elohim, even in its biblical context, is very explicit about its exceptionalism, because it actually, at least in one of the places that it's mentioned, is followed by the idea that humans should fructify and multiply, that is, Peru Uravu, and fill the earth and rule over other species. So it's actually very explicit. It's not subtle. We tend not to do the rest of the verse. So even before we get into that, I think it actually bears mention that Tselem Elohim is not just a tick of the progressive sort of Jewish and Christian left or liberal. It has historically been deployed both to include and to exclude. The way Tselem Elohim is used is sometimes, it's used to say, we all count. So you have progressive Christians, for example, the UCC, the United Church of Christ, progressive mainline Protestant denomination, has some beautiful midrash, essentially, that reads Tselem Elohim together with Black Lives Matter to essentially argue that you need to remember the sanctity of all human life needs to include a focus on Black life because of its disproportionate targeting for death. So that we do see that invocation of Tselem Elohim. But we also see Hitler having used Tselem Elohim specifically to exclude Jews and people of African descent. So the way Tselem Elohim works can be to include people in the category of the human, but it can also be used by the same token to deny the humanity of certain individuals. So the category of a human is a classifying category, and the priestly layer of the Bible, which is the authorship of Genesis 1, in which we find the concept of Tselem Elohim, is very open about that. It's not an obviously progressive thing, and there's a reason that right-wing thinkers, so scientific racists who try to reconcile the Bible with evolution, would posit a theory of what they called polygenesis, which is basically what do you do with the idea of the creation of human in Genesis 1 if you're a racist? And so we see this theory emerging. Essentially, it's a theory of zoology that distinguishes the creation of the human as the creation of white people. It's sort of saying that the creation account in Genesis 1:26, in which God says on the sixth day, let us create the Adam creature, etc., in our image and likeness, that was white people. And people of color were created at different times, and they're actually a different species. And so what you have there is a use of science of the time, in the sense that it is a form of classification, dividing creaturely life into different species, that is married with an idea of specific kinds of exceptionalism. What we often do in progressive or left or liberal Jewish circles, even actually center and even sort of more right circles, but particularly in middle to left, is to declare that the two fundamental principles of Judaism are Tselem Elohim, the idea that the human is made in God's image, and tikkun olam, which you can translate as fixing, repairing, or mending the world. And those are taken to be axiomatic principles of justice. And I argue that hidden in the idea of Tselem Elohim is a very problematic legacy that needs to be reckoned with, especially in the age of climate catastrophe. You have to have a broader lens when thinking about human justice than just the human.
Yeah. Thank you for taking us in. I want to sit more with this word that comes up in your book a lot, species. And I love that you already brought us to a place that I'm excited to talk about, which is like a lot of what your book discusses, at least as I read it, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the ways we delineate, categorize, etc., species in 2025 US context, certainly, but even in many other 21st century contexts, we sort of are inculcated with this notion that those lines and categories just are true. This Linnaean notion of classifying species and above those genus and order, like the whole thing that many of us probably learned in middle school, high school. What's fascinating is you highlight many ways in which those delineations are actually hotly contested in contexts that spend a lot of time thinking about different species. And that even Jewishly, there's like different frameworks and different delineations and different ways of navigating those conversations. So I'd love to go a little bit into that. I mean, the core question that I would love to explore is like, on the one hand, humans are a species that is a kind of animal, right? Like that is one subcategory of creatures,
Correct.
we might say. On the other hand, we have all these different examples where humans really are sort of separate. There's animals and then there's humans, and humans are above, have domain. That's really interesting. That is a hard square to circle or circle to square. And so I guess I'd love to dive a little bit into what's a species? Why does it matter to this question of in the image of God? Because like you've hinted at one of the ramifications, which is like, if these lines are not actually as scientific as we've been taught, turns out horrific people can draw those lines in ways that delineate certain kinds of humans as a lower species than others, and that can be racist and that can do all sorts of harm. There are also ways in which even the existing lines we have around, what is the word, speciation? I don't actually know the right, where those might be doing harm. Take us into some of those questions and a little bit of how the rabbis kind of explore that.
We can think about this word species in lots of ways. The word species itself derives from Latin and actually comes from the same root of the word to see, to look, like think about spectacles or spectate. And it connotes ways of grouping things that are alike. Our present day use of the word species is thoroughly indebted to this bloke that you mentioned, Carolus Linnaeus, who is in a way still responsible for the way we think about the practice of science, and high schools included in that teach zoology and, biology, right? So what he did was to create these three kingdoms of creaturely life and to name and classify. And sometimes he actually drew. We actually have some of his sketches to name and classify all of creaturely life. And some scholars, there's a scholar called Donna Haraway who gives him a great name, the second Adam. We have in Genesis 2 an account of Adam naming all of creaturely life. And in a way, Linnaeus took upon this task. And he organized this knowledge not just into different kinds of creatures, so, organized by whether they are in the air or in the land or in the sea, right? Mammals and so on. All these ideas, these categories are human ways of organizing, right? They're not in the world. This is humans looking around and seeing the proliferation of life forms and trying to create some kind of order. For him, the most basic unit of being is the species. It's the smallest classificatory model. So for example, the dog and the wolf, this is before Darwin, so it's before an understanding of evolution, are separate species, and say the coyote, but they are all, under the kind of general rubric, say, of canines, or different, the blackbird and the dove might be different species under the general category of avines. These are the sort of genuses and families and so on that build up. And one way in which we see that it is, Darwin himself actually talks about how the idea of species is contingent. You make a decision to lump a certain group of birds together. You choose things that to you indicate this is one community. You look at two different birds that you see on a tree and you say they both have white feathers and a crest that looks like this and a beak that looks like that. And yes, there's maybe different kinds of speckling on the front, but it's the same species. Somebody else could be looking for different things and make a different grouping. So Darwin, who builds his idea of evolution, admits that the unit of the species is somewhat subjective.
And it kind of has to be an evolution, right? Like if species sort of shift and change generationally,
Right.
like it would be hard for him to make an argument that there is that hard and fast delineation.
That's true. Maybe with the theory of evolution, that's true. But even today, though, you still have a different interpretation of data. So biologists, zoologists argue whether or not they've discovered a new species, or is this just a variant of the same species? Biologists and philosophers of science debate about, is species something that exists in the world, and or is it actually just a pragmatic term that doesn't actually exist, that we use to organize just the messiness of life? We often are very naive about science. We'll have a critique of capitalism. We'll have a critique about gender. We'll have a critique about race. But often science to us is where we stop our critique, and we don't see how science itself is humanly made. And one of the things that Linnaeus did is he actually thought that there were different species of humans, and he organized them racially. 4 subspecies: Homo sapiens, I think it was Americanus, which for him were Native Americans or indigenous folks in the Americas; Homo sapiens europaeus, Homo sapiens asiaticus, Asian, and Homo sapiens afer, African. And he organized them in he didn't know about evolution, but he, as you can imagine, there's a huge racialization and racist project going on in that organization of species that has not entirely left science. What I'm trying to say is that species is not a neutral concept. How we see likeness and difference is a highly politicized, racialized, gendered project in which we are putting our own perspective onto the world. Now, that way of looking at the world is not exactly the same as what you find with the rabbinic concept of min. So minim is a word that means, I would translate it as kind. It's a word that the rabbis inherit from the Hebrew Bible.
Kind as like the noun, not kind the adjective to be kind to someone. Kind like a type, a kind.
Correct. Yes. The noun, and the example I would give is the first chapter of Genesis describes God creating various things according to their kind. For instance, the inhabitants that God creates of water, earth, skies are described leminehem, which means according to their kinds. God is creating various kinds of creatures. Leviticus 11, which is probably authored by the same group that authored Genesis 1, the so-called priestly authors, is a chapter in the Hebrew Bible that delineates creatures according to their purity and impurity resonances. And there too, you'll have something like Orev lemino, the raven according to its kind. So there's a way that min is being used. The word min, some argue the etymology of the word min comes from a word also related to likeness, like temuna, a picture, a likeness, and seems to also be this way of organizing like kinds together. So it's a way of cutting up the messiness of the word and organizing things and naming things. This is the project. I want to give an example of the way likeness and species and racialization work together, which is the ways that white people can't see distinctions between people who they racialize as black or brown. So the idea of you all look alike, this problematic way in which vision itself, our ability to other, is partly enabled by rendering large, differentiated, heterogeneous groups of people as if they're all the same. I'm often mistaken for another white, non-binary Jewish academic and have been literally introduced as that person several times. So there's sort of like this way of fusing together difference and without differentiation.
Yeah. I'm flashing in this conversation about species. I'm thinking about how I was educated, because I think, all of us are inculcated with some of these assumptions that you're describing. Like, I remember being in school, I don't remember what grade, but for some reason, we were in like science class, and we were given a chart that was like, here's the smartest animals.
Wow.
And even as a middle schooler, I remember being flummoxed by this. And I actually remember like challenging the teacher, like asking, like, I'm not saying this to say like, oh, look at how cool I was. Like, just genuinely, it was
just
strange
it happens to
me.
be an outcome. It's not why you're doing it.
Yeah. It was this chart, and it was like, okay, humans are the smartest, and then it was like gorillas and apes. Like, I don't remember the precise order, but it was like primates that are similar. I remember vividly, pig was 10th. I don't know why I remember that, but pig was number 10 on this list. We were like told that day, like pigs are really smart for mammals. Fine. Dolphins were pretty high on the list. Like, and I remember even as a middle schooler, high schooler, I was like, well, we're making the list though. Like we're, and I don't remember what my teacher said to me. They might have just like, Lex, we don't have time for that. Like, this is just the chart that we're looking at. But like, it's
Stop asking questions, Lex. Yeah.
If like dogs made a list of what the most important or most smart or whatever species in the world are, I would presume dogs would put dogs at the top because they're dogs, and like and they would measure other species. And like, obviously I understand that the ways I'm talking about measuring and listing, like I'm not saying all animals can like go about that, but obviously we thought about what we are in the world, and we kind of looked around and we're like, which things are closest to us and most able to do the things that we take pride in. Primates are towards the top of that list, and pigs have some of those, and dolphins have some of those. And then we made what we claimed to be a scientific list that probably reflects more about us than about some metaphysical reality of the universe. But we just sort of take that and accept it. We know from looking at different species, like there are things that lots of species do better than humans. That's not radical. That like, depending on what you privilege as like a characteristic of a species that is good in the world, or that is useful, to use a problematic term, or that is smart even, there are things that humans don't know how to fathom that animals intuit.
Right. So this is also what we're doing is we're not just dividing life, we're assigning value. And that is also a way of saying which humans we value, because we're saying humans without these particular capacities are less human. And that's disability, right? That's the history of disability. That's the way that the discipline of zoology, evolution, go hand in hand with eugenics. There's a reason that you can study the history of science and learn about the histories of ableism and racism. And of course, sexism, right? Because certain beings have certain capacities that we value and certain beings don't. And not only are we often wrong in the sense that if we say rationality, speech, religion, whatever it is you want to say is a sign of intelligence, not only are we wrong in the sense that often so-called non-humans have those particular capacities, but also we are just as likely to be wrong about those being worthy of elevation. So yeah, I'm kind of shocked that you were given that chart, but also not shocked. And the thing that you pointed out that, we're making the list. So of course we're going to be at the top of the list. It reminds me of the way, I'm trying to remember which philosopher said this. I think it was Xenophanes who said something like, if horses or cows or lions could paint their gods would look like themselves. And that's exactly what's going on with the whole Tselem Elohim thing. And that ideology is being continued in just a scientific idiom. The problem with species cuts is there's a massive binary. On the one hand, it's many, many species. So you could argue that there's a massive, it's not a binary, it's just myriads and myriads of multiple entities. But what's informing it is the author of the list, and the real binary at hand is the human and the non-human. And it doesn't stop between the human and the non-human, because you're always policing who is a human and who is a non-human. And that means you're turning it onto humans as well. Now, the rabbis are part of this project, but not in the same sense. And I think that maybe the thing that is worth saying is that Tselem Elohim is surprisingly unimportant for them. In fact, I think that it is fair to say that if you were to meet a rabbi in Roman Palestine in the 3rd century or the 2nd century, or in the 4th century in Iraq, that is Babylonia, and you were to say the most important things in Judaism are Tselem Elohim and Tikkun Olam, you would meet with a kind of confusion. And it's not because they weren't progressive. They weren't progressive, but that's not why. It's because they didn't make all that much of it. And here I'm also setting myself against a bunch of folks, many people in rabbinics who, I'm talking about scholars and rabbis, who, even if they don't see themselves as particularly liberal or progressive, also assume a centrality. But if you actually say, look at the literature that the rabbis produce between, early second century and the early third century, so there's a bunch of compilations that come out from Palestine at that time. The Mishnah is one of them. It's organized thematically. And very little is really done with Tselem Elohim. It's true that Rabbi Akiva in the tractate called Tractate of the Daddies, the chapters of the fathers, it's true that...
Which I like to remind people is gendered with the ot ending, which is feminine but masculine here, which is a fun little queer shout out.
Right, which is sort of how, yes, that's true. But it's still very much daddies, a transmission, a kind of genealogy of dads. So Rabbi Akiva talks about the way that Tselem Elohim, the image of God, is a mark of God's love for humans, which is, of course, a very self-congratulatory way of seeing that particular phrase. But the way that that term really has purchase in this third century corpus of rabbinic literature is the rabbis take the concatenation, the sequencing of God describing humans as being in God's image, and the way God follows it up with fructify and multiply, or, what's the other, the more common translation is reproduce, be fruitful and multiply. I like fructify because I like the way that it actually tells you something about the ways they understood reproduction related to fruiting. I'm a very literal translator. So fructify and multiply. And what the rabbis do is they take what is clearly in its context a blessing that's also made, by the way, in Genesis 1 to non-human animals. It's not a uniquely human blessing. And they flip it into an obligation, because that's what rabbis do. They like to kind of proliferate and multiply obligation. That's their currency. That's the currency of being Jewish. So the idea is that this is not a blessing, but a command. They liken proliferation and fructification to proliferating images of God. Here's where they don't run with it. They run with it in the sense that if you kill a human, it's like toppling an image of God. Fine. What they don't really do is that much more with it. And they make the obligation to reproduce surprisingly modest. That is, plural. Should have 2 children. It's minimally an obligation to have 2 children. And I don't see it doing a ton more work. The rabbis will take far less biblical verbiage to do far more. And they don't do that in this case. What do? They take biblical writing in Leviticus 11, which is, again, a kind of bestiary of pure and impure creatures, and they run with that. Because it's a fairly minimal bestiary. If you read Leviticus 11, it doesn't actually run through all animals that you and I would even know. And the same was true for the rabbis. And so they use that to essentially create unruly and noisy menagerie of animals. And there you have a project that has humans making classificatory models, but they do so in a way that I argue is very queer, and they slip the human into that menagerie. The human becomes an animal.
I really enjoyed the parts of your book, and I'm looking forward to the ways in which your class will look at that human as, or human one of. I think that there's a lot to really consider about how implicitly and explicitly the ways we go about navigating the world have been so thoroughly premised on the idea that humans either aren't animal, to call someone an animal is to insult them, at least colloquially. We could go into whether that should be the case or not. I do think it operates as the case most of the time. And so it's interesting, I'm sort of left with a question that's going to boil down to okay, so what? Which I'm not saying to say your book doesn't matter.
No, say it. I like it.
The so what question is basically, given this, I'm curious how we can start to think as listeners and maybe as students in your class about, okay, what shifts about us or what could change about us if or once we unravel, unwind, untangle, to go with your class's title, Tselem Elohim. Like, how does this cause us to be different? Because, I mean, my instinct, and maybe I'm speaking partially as somebody who is a vegetarian. I don't like either way, I'm not somebody who thinks everybody needs to be a vegetarian. But like, this has implications for not only how we read Genesis 1 or Leviticus 11, but how we mobilize ourselves as Jews. I mean, I'm even thinking this time of year with Passover in a couple days, there's animals actually that are very much part of that story, but I think they are instrumentalized by, like the frogs exist to be a plague for the sake of human liberation. Like, there's not much about the frogs as the second plague, other than that they're there and that they're a plague, and then they are the second of 10 steps that sort of lead to a group of humans being able to be liberated. I don't have a deep answer to like what would change about the Seder in particular, but like, how might our actual Jewish practice today shift given that we untangle Tselem Elohim?
Yeah. No, I love that question. I mean, I think that the first so what is I think need to stop saying Tselem Elohim. We need to take accountability for the harm that it does. Instead of including people in the category of the human, we need to attend to who is excluded. Here's another thing we need to do. We need to stop saying it about animals. It is a pronoun. Which is a pronoun. That is a pronoun. Not the frogs that, the frogs who. I mean, literally our language is inflected with dehumanizing. So this is where I'm actually really interested in the way that there's actually allied struggles.
Dehumanizing.
Yes, dehumanizing in a negative sense, or let's call it this, depersonifying, devaluing. And just like, we're very aware, say, of language around pronouns, around gender, one thing we can start to think about is when we say it and when we say he, she, and they, and how we're signifying value. Number 3 is multi-species justice. To think about justice as a multi-species project, to think of ourselves as allies with other creatures, and not just creatures that we see as species, but organisms. Start to listen to the teachings of other kinds and other ways of being. I will say that I love the way you're linking it with Passover, because I think that there's a way to wonder about telling a story of the so-called plagues from the point of view, not just of the Egyptians, which is, I think, a really, every time we talk about the Egyptians, I think the word Egypt, to sort of think it's okay. It's just as not cool to go around thinking it's okay to say the evil Egyptians. Well, there's actually a country called Egypt. I mean, there is a kind of, okay, so just that's an aside. But to sort of think about what would it be like to think of frogs as not a makkah, as not a plague, or kinim, lice, not just as a plague, or arbe, locusts, not just as a plague. There is, I think, fascinating and important learning to be done about famine, human overproduction, agriculture, and the relationship to various kinds of creatures who compete with us for resources. That can be part of the story. So too can the sickness of animals. That's one of the plagues, right? Which to me is potentially a resource. It's a very opposite reading, because it's not saying, yay, these things happened. Oh, God's saving the Israelites. But rather it's sort of saying that a plague to the Egyptians is a plague to the human, to the so-called conceit of the human. Maybe actually questioning the boundary between the Israelites and the Egyptians, and wondering about what it means to live in a time of catastrophe when species are becoming extinct. These, I think, are questions that can arise, a very different avenue that is thinking about liberation outside of a binary narrative of good humans and bad humans, and outside the kind of good and evil narrative of the Israelites versus the Egyptians, which is frankly a very complicated narrative, I think, to be telling in today's world. I don't want to be teaching my 3.5-year-old that it's okay to grow up so that the first encounter you have with the word Egypt is figured as a malevolent genocidal figure. That is not a neutral story to be telling people. Even if you then go on to metaphoricize it, you've already introduced someone to the word Egypt and Egyptian as somebody who's after the Jews. Because, of course, the slippage between Israelite and Jew happens all the time. Of course, we tend to say the Jews went out of Egypt when even the Hebrew Bible doesn't say that. That's my preaching.
Yeah. That's a good so what. That's a really important so what for this story. I wanted to close with a question that hopefully will full circle us a little bit. But you mentioned the queerness of some of this, and I don't want that to go absent today.
No.
You talked about people sort of perceive that this conversation about lots of species is not about binary, but it does in many ways go to upending sort of human v non-human. That's a good window in. But there's a whole other side of your book, and we don't have time to go into all the ins and outs, but you go into, including in your title, when a human gives birth to a raven. And in the same way that calling somebody an animal could be seen as insulting, I think we live in a society where if one were to say queer folks or queerness are actually arising in a conversation about interspecies generation or reproduction, I think a lot of people would take that as, how dare you? That's insulting. That's implying that queer people are to be compared to something that we have marked as very negative. And yet, your book's title is doing that. And so I don't want folks to leave this episode hanging with that curiosity. Take us into that title and to some of the realms of your book that allow us to re-understand, I'm going to say reproduction in quotes, but what you term generation.
Yes, totally. Thank you. So I'll say one thing. The title of the book is a provocation to entering into a world in which it was possible that a human could give birth to a raven. In other words, it's an invitation to be with the rabbis and other people in the ancient Middle East who faced a radical unpredictability about reproduction as sameness and species lines, even as they thought, like we do, to classify and order the world. All kinds of new creatures could arise, right? That, including what we today would call fantastic or mythological creatures, but which for the rabbis existed. Centaurs, dragons, mice brought about after a rainfall from mud. It's a very different kind of universe in which everything is teeming with the potential to become a life form, a creature. And humans can sometimes give birth to different creatures. And a few things to be said about that in terms of the kind of queerness, and not just queerness, but gender. Number one, there is a certain degree, and this is going to be about actually Jewishness as a kind of species. There's a certain tendency in scholarship to imagine and backdate racist and eugenics thinking onto the rabbis. That is, in the conversations about who is a Jew and, matrilineal versus patrilineal descent and Jewish continuity and the need to procreate, what you will find is in both rabbinics, in scholarship that looks at the ancient rabbis, and this is especially inaugurated by a very influential article that was a response to the surveys about the increasing intermarriage, and I'm using such massive quotes on that, by Shia Cohen, who's a scholar of rabbinics, who essentially argued that the ban against interspecies mating, what in Hebrew is called kilayim, mixed kinds, is related to, or is the explanation for, the ban against intermarriage and the production of the principle of matrilineal descent. So there's this link between a ban on mixed marriages and mixed species mating. And one of the things I want to show is that this is just not the case. That link between hybridized animals, quote unquote, and mixed marriage, and I'm using quotes with mixed and I'm using quotes with intermarriage, that is simply scientific racism. That idea that you understand humans as racialized like species and that you track, you sort of assign classificatory and genetic continuity, coupled with the fear of vanishing species extinction, that is scientific racism. There's no two ways about it. So that's one thing, which is to say the rabbis were not actually, they did not tag kilayim, multi-species mating, as particularly moralized. And they did not ever join it to what we, I think the term intermarriage is a racist term, but let's just call it marriage between people of different religious identifications. I know that's very long, but I find the term intermarriage and mixed marriage, it's the same language that the scientific racists use to describe and to compare miscegenation. It's just the same language, so I refuse to use it. I'm not saying the rabbis were wonderful and queer and fantastic and anti-racist. No, but this is not their legacy. This is a much later insistence to read their writings that way. And the other thing that people on the right sometimes do is to compare, or even scholars will sometimes compare the ban against same-sex sex between men to bestiality or mixed kinds. And I show that this is just not something that the rabbis do.
Which it's also strange because
yes, exactly.
It's two same
exactly
sex versus mix. That one doesn't even quite map.
Correct. So right. So actually, and this is the other positive thing I do, I show that on the contrary, the rabbis see straight, that is hetero mating, as a form of kilayim in a certain sense. But here's where it gets queer. The rabbis understand human reproduction. Here's where they use the image of God in a way that's potentially self-congratulatory. They use the idea that God says, let's make humans in our image and our likeness. And then when God meets the first Adam, God says, oh, I've made you in my image and my likeness, reproduce and multiply, or fructify and multiply. What do they do with that? They say there are three partners in the creation of the human. That is, they understand that the idea that humans are in the divine image and that they are supposed to reproduce to be a mechanism for how humans reproduce. They basically say, and they compare the human to a mule. So the mule is a product of a donkey and a horse. And the human, they say, in parallel, is the product of God, a mother, and a father, which is, still straight, but it's a ménage à trois. And they mean this in a very literal, embodied way. It's not a metaphor. It's true that God contributes speech, like God contributes certain aspect of the physical human, contributes the animating breath and various other faculties and the eyes. But it's also a material, like God is one of your parents. What this does is it opens the door for all kinds of other potential beings to enter into reproduction. And they do. So demons can enter into human reproduction. Statues can enter into human reproduction. Smells, thoughts. And this is where, to my mind, there's something very queer. And it's not just, so the irony is that the human is potentially produced not necessarily by same species sex between a cis hetero monogamous couple. The human is potentially comes into the world through many causes. There are many possible participants that bring about the life of the human. And of course, this is also the case with other beings too, other creatures. So that, to me, is a rebuff to the way that the right used Tselem Elohim to try to say God created man and woman and reproduction, right? They will read those same verses as a way to say, even, the so-called Judeo-Christian tradition, which of course is a Christian idea of religion, they'll say, going back to Genesis 1, we see that humans were created divinely in the order of man, woman, and reproduction only in that context. Whereas for the rabbis, there's always been more beings involved. In the current moment around reproductive justice, attacks on trans people, and so on and so forth, it feels particularly important to show where certain invocations of Judaism are just simply off.
What an amazing note to end on. We have a million more angles we could discuss, but that's what we've got 3 weeks of your class for. So I hope that people will sign up. thank you so much, Rafael Neis, for joining us. It's been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you. Likewise. Thanks, Lex.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. Here's the deal, y'all. You just heard from Rafael Neis, but there's more. 3 weeks more by signing up for Untangling Tselem Elohim, which you can do at judaismunbound.com/classes. There is financial aid available for anybody who needs it. There are also 2 other mini courses offered, so you can double up, you can triple up, you can learn more about the Onion Yeshiva's awesome mini courses that are available now. And again, just do so by heading to judaismunbound.com/classes. We also encourage you to be in touch with us with any questions, visions, ideas you have built on this conversation or others. You can send me an email at lex@judaismunbound.com, or you can email our organization as a whole by sending a note to hello@judaismunbound.com. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.